This is eds1200 presentation on the issue of asylum seeker. The issue recently caught the eye of media around Australia was the issue of asylum seekers, flagged as boat people. In the last decade, Australia has reduced the intake of refugees, even though the number of persons displaced by war and persecution is on increase. Asylum seekers differ from legal migrants as they do not have any documentation from their resettlement. It was quite astonishing how political parties were capitalizing on these issues as a major policy in their election campaign during 2010 election. Leaders of both parties portray image of asylum seekers as threat to Australia's national identity. They were capitalizing on Australian people's threat of losing their identity as they are attacked by others called asylum seekers. Australian identity under major threat as having refugees from various nations can have major impact on what constitutes Australia. The people of Australia were threatened as their collective identity was overridden by these asylum seekers. They were in dilemma that what will happen if the country will be full of these asylum seekers. What would they be able to call Australia home? Even though Australia is considered as a multicultural nation and based on idea of immigration, the incident of illegal immigration by means of asylum seekers or boat people threatens the imaginary space of white Australia. The people as a community are threatened by increase in non-white people. Australia is largely a white nation. The collective identity of white Australians still has the barrier to accept the identity of other people which are non-white and integrate it with receptive nature. The typical Australian is still white. The people who are Australian citizens but do not fit the Aussie values in terms of language, dress code and culture do not qualify as Australian. The refugees are different in their relation with what constitute typical Australian. The image of these asylum seekers on the television give appearance that they're different as their racial background, color, skin and languages are different from legitimate Australians. Therefore, they are processed for prolonged period of time in order to identify their suitability in Australian context. Whether they fit the legitimate Australian characteristic or not, it depends on their suitability to Australian value and culture. Thus, even though the Australian society is multicultural and receptive towards all other cultures, if the person doesn't fit the imaginary white collective space of Australian people, they are not welcome in Australia. Australia as a tolerant society allows immigration based on immigration policies. Thus, Australian society is tolerant toward the migration based on the proper policies, but when it comes to asylum seekers, they are not that tolerant. In order to raise the awareness about the asylum seekers and their actual situation for leaving their home country, the teaching method and curriculum should involve the study of political background of nations which are under internal conflicts. The case studies and seminars that portrays the real picture of these nations are ideal to raise awareness and knowledge amongst teenagers in grade 7 to 10. This will create more respect towards the asylum seekers and migrants who suffered trauma, and it will help them better integrate in the society. The education helps in creating next generation which will be more clear about their identity and differences between them and the others such as asylum seekers. The perception towards other would be different. They will not be threatened by coexistence of other. Thus, education system should embrace intercultural education which goes beyond the boundaries of traditional historical and political knowledge of European and other developed countries and look into the world issues in the nations which are underdeveloped or developing in order to clear the doubts into the people's mind about the nature of their existence. The event should be used to develop ideological base in order to form the alliance across race, gender, class, religion and political lines, which would help achieve the goal of racial equality through education. In the situ of asylum seeker, major focus in terms of education would be to teach humanitarianism, which is somewhat ignored in the formal curriculum across Australia. The books and the work of humanitarian writers and subjects should be included in the curriculum, which focus on the greater good of humankind irrespective of their identity in terms of race, class, gender, skin color and religion. The main challenge exists when the asylum seekers are granted to live in Australia, as they suffer from discrimination from mainstream culture dominant within Australia. The support can be provided by teachers by means of multicultural counseling and therapy that focuses on reconciliation support, coping with the post-traumatic stress, assistance in acculturation and assimilation, and avoiding marginalization. This event allows me to work as an educator who is committed to develop practices which places greater emphasis on diversity in education that is aimed to be equally effective for all children. The principle of education should be based on non-categorization, so the education requirement for students is determined by their additional education requirement, not for the specific qualifying or learning disability due to their racial background. As I told before, the case study would be ideal way to do this. Also, we can have a classroom discussion that what actually goes in those countries. This will bring the light in the education system about these asylum seekers. Thank you.